There's an entire generation of people who remember both rotary phones and the first iPhone launch, and psychologists still don't quite know where to file them. If you were born between about 1976 and 1985, you technically land on the tail end of Gen X, but you don't really feel like classic Gen X. And you're not fully a millennial either, even though people keep trying to force you into that box. You're part of what researchers started calling a Xennial around the mid-2010s, sometimes even described as a microgeneration, because the window is so specific. And that specificity matters because what happened during that narrow slice of history created a set of experiences that's genuinely worth examining from a psychological point of view. From the beginning, you grew up in an analog world, one where boredom was just something you sat with. You memorized phone numbers because you had to. If you missed your favorite TV show, it didn't live online somewhere waiting for you. It was just gone. And in your teen years, your social world ran on things that were physical and temporary. Passing notes in class, calling landlines and hoping the right person answered, making plans and then simply showing up because there was no way to update the plan once you left the house. If you were running late, you couldn't text. If your friend wasn't there, you waited and wondered. That world required a different kind of trust, commitment, and patience than the one we live in now. And then, right as you were moving into adulthood, the entire world went digital. Not gradually, suddenly. The timing of that shift had consequences that are still playing out. Most generations grow up almost entirely inside one technological paradigm. Older generations had their identities and habits set before digital life became unavoidable. Younger generations grew up with the internet as a background constant, so it doesn't feel like a change to them. It feels like reality. But Xennials lived through both, and not just in a casual way. You went through both of these life-defining environments during the same stretch of years when you were still figuring out who you were. That's important, because in terms of brain development, your late teens and early 20s are not just adult life starting. There's still a high plasticity period. The prefrontal cortex, the region involved in things like decision-making, self-control planning, and adapting to complex new situations, continues maturing well into the 20s. So while the world was being rewritten by the internet, mobile phones, and social platforms, many Xennials were still in the developmental window where environment powerfully shapes long-term behavior patterns. You were young enough that learning new technology felt natural, but old enough to remember exactly what existed before it. That combination creates a kind of psychological bilingualism that's rare. You can have a face-to-face conversation without reflexively checking your phone every 30 seconds because you spent years practicing presence as the default. You know what it feels like to be unreachable for hours and not interpret that as a crisis. You understand boredom as a real emotional state that you can survive without immediately anesthetizing it with content. At the same time, you're not intimidated by new tools in the way some older adults can be, because you learned the digital world while you were still flexible enough to absorb it quickly. You watch the sequence happen in real time. Early chat, early social networks, early profiles, early online identities, Friendster, MySpace, Facebook, then smartphones, then constant connectivity, then the explosion of messaging apps. And you adapt. Not because you were trying to be trendy, but because the ground underneath everyday life was shifting, and you had to learn how to stand on it. This shows up in subtle ways you might not even notice, especially in your relationship with privacy and memory. You grew up in a world where embarrassing moments usually evaporated. That awkward haircut, that teenage heartbreak, that messy party story. For most of your early life, those things lived in people's recollections, not in searchable archives. They faded. They softened. They turned into stories. And psychologically, that's closer to how human memory naturally works. Autobiographical memory isn't a perfect recording. It's reconstructive. Your brain edits, updates, compresses, and reinterprets the past, keeping what's meaningful and letting other things dissolve. When life becomes permanently documented, photos, posts, messages, tags, that natural process gets disrupted. Your past stops being something you internally metabolize and starts becoming something externally preserved, sometimes in unflattering detail. Xennials had enough pre-digital life to develop a sense of identity that wasn't built under constant surveillance, but enough digital life to understand what it means to live with a persistent record. That tension alone shapes how you think about who you are, who you were, and what you're allowed to leave behind. But then there's the other major factor that makes this cohort psychologically distinct: the economy. Many Xennials entered the job market or were trying to establish themselves right around the 2008 financial crisis. And that's not just an interesting historical detail. Timing matters. There's a big psychological difference between experiencing economic instability at 45 versus experiencing it at 23 when you're trying to build a life foundation. Financial stress during the years when you're supposed to be gaining stability can create a lasting imprint, what people often describe as a kind of quiet financial hypervigilance. Even when things improve later, the nervous system remembers what it felt like when the floor dropped out. It changes how you think about risk, security, loyalty to employers, saving, spending, and long-term planning. It can make you adaptable, but also guarded, resourceful, but also privately anxious. Optimistic